Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the forum. I'm Alan Jones, Dean Emeritus of Grace Cathedral, and it's a great honor for me to be able to be the moderator of this conversation. For 8 weeks from January to March, the Violins of Hope are making their West Coast debut, presented by music at Kohl Mansion in collaboration with more than 40 partnership organizations, concert halls, museums, public libraries, schools, churches and synagogues, and community centers. What we're going to ask and think about, and it'll be very frustrating for us because the time will go quickly and we've got a lot to talk about. What and how and why do we remember? And music is the antidote, maybe, for a little bit, the antidote to our amnesia. Music at Kohl Mansion has also commissioned a special chamber work inspired by the stories of these violins, a collection of 86 string instruments originally owned and played by European Jews in ghettos and Nazi death camps during World War II. They've been lovingly restored over the past 2 decades by renowned Israeli violin makers Amnon and Avshalom Weinstein. 51 of these violins have traveled to the Bay Area. So we're fortunate to have with us today one of the founders of this collection, the composer of the commissioned chamber work, and the violinist who will perform it at Grace Cathedral on February the 21st. So please join me in welcoming Avshalom Weinstein, Jake Heggie, and Rebecca Jackson. Just a background question for all of you that's, since I'm the moderator, I'm allowed to do this. I feel both inspired and uncomfortable by these violins, and the notion that some inspired Nazis in Auschwitz listened to Schubert in the evening and killed people in the morning is something that sort of frightens and depresses me when we think about the phrase "never again" when we live in a society when, well, it could happen again. So I want to talk to Avshi first. Could you tell us the story of how this collection came about? Why are we here? How did we get here with these violins?
Well, if you want to dig far enough, so we all know what happened in 1933 when Hitler got into power in Germany. And what the Nazi party did was basically to make it impossible for Jewish people to stay in Germany. They couldn't work anymore, not in orchestras, not in other places. And slowly, there were thousands of different laws which basically made it impossible for them to stay in Germany. And what happened was when Brunislav Huberman, who was one of the leading violinists of the time, he saw what was going on and he decided to try and establish an orchestra in Palestine, in Israel. He took some of the leading musicians from all over Europe, brought them to Palestine, established his orchestra. And in 1945, after the war, when survivors started coming to Israel telling about all the thousands of different atrocities, there was a very strong ban in Israel on everything German. Nobody wanted to touch anything German, nobody wanted to buy anything German. And many of those musicians, they had German-made instruments, and they simply came to my grandfather, who immigrated himself from Poland with my grandmother in 1938. They both left behind a very big family. My grandfather had 11 brothers and sisters. Only one of his brothers survived. My grandmother had 7 or 8 brothers and sisters, and none of her family survived. Right. And my grandfather bought the instruments he could, but he knew that he will never be able to sell them because nobody wanted to touch anything German. And it stayed for many years until in 1991, my father had an apprentice from Dresden, which you all know until 1989 was basically Eastern Germany. Now in Eastern Germany, like in most of the Soviet Union, Jewish Holocaust did not exist.
Right.
They wouldn't talk about the Jewish Holocaust. Of course, they would talk about the Great Patriotic War and everything, but all the mass killing sites and the concentration camps, the signs would say, here were killed so-and-so Soviet citizens. Never if they were Jewish, Polish, Russians, Gypsies, whatever. And when this apprentice, Daniel Schmidt, he saw the instruments that we had. And he asked my father, how come that in Tel Aviv in the 30s and 40s, when Tel Aviv in those times was few streets with camels rather than cars, you could get such great German instruments. So my father told him the story about the establishment of the orchestra and how those instruments came to our possession. And he asked my father to give a lecture in Germany to the German Violin and Bow Making Association about those instruments and how they came to Israel. And afterwards, my father spoke on a radio show, which was, let's call it the Facebook of those times. After the war, there was a radio show which people would call and say, I'm coming from this and that village, I'm looking for my mother, for my father, for whatever. And people will call back or send a letter saying, yes, we saw them, we know what happened. And this is how people kind of learned what happened to their families. You're talking about 1946, 1947. Right. And this show was going on until basically end of the 90s when my father spoke. And we started to get more and more instruments with stories. And today we have 87 instruments. And we have 52 here. We just got 2 more instruments just before arriving here. And hopefully there will be more.
I was taken with, a friend of mine gave me a mastering of a Mahler 9th, I think, which was recorded in 1938 in Vienna by Bruno Walter. And in February 1938, he recorded it. And by the end of that year, he had to flee. I mean, there was that whole thing.
There was the emancipation of Austria, yes.
That's right. So the Anschluss and all those things, yeah. What inspired you to follow in the footsteps? You're a part of this family, your grandfather and your father.
Well, me and my father are very, very different persons, although many people will say we are very much alike. Of course, my father was born in 1939 in Israel. And he was born to a family which included his mother, his father, and later on my aunt, his sister. When I was born in 1976, I had grandparents. I had sisters and brothers later, and of course cousins and uncles. We have a very big family, especially also here in the United States. But this is all from my mother's side. And my father, for him to deal with the Holocaust was a very painful thing because his parents never spoke about it. They never spoke about it. They never spoke about their own families, what happened to them. We do not even know how much they actually knew what happened to those who stayed behind. But my mother did not know her father, my grandfather. He died the last few days of the war somewhere in Germany. We don't know even where. But I don't know if any of you heard about the Bielski partisans. This was the partisan group that saved basically more Jewish people than anyone else. They saved over 1,232 people, including Gerard Kushner's grandparents. They were saved also in the Bielski camp. This is why Trump says that he knows people that whose grandparents were saved in the war. And my grandfather, after they were released, he was sent to the Russian army and later on killed. But when I was growing up, and we would go to see my grandmother, the bedtime stories were partisan stories. So for me, growing up with stories about the Holocaust this is how I grew up. It was something which I dealt with and I knew basically all my life from a very different point of view of, let's say, the vast majority of survivors.
Yeah. When I was growing up in England, the violinists were Jewish. Yehudi Menuhin.
Yeah, Yehudi Menuhin had lots of problems in Israel after the war because he was the first one to go and play in Germany. And many people saw it as a bad thing. I have lots of very good German friends. We did lots of things in Germany and hopefully we will do more, but this might have been too early. I think he was there in 1952 or something like that.
Yeah.
So it was Too many people felt it's too early.
Too early. Heifetz as well was.
Heifetz, I don't know. I'm not so sure.
And Fritz Kreisler was an early one in the 1920s.
Yeah, but this is before the war. That's a different thing. Fritz Kreisler actually played for the American soldiers in Europe, if I remember correct. He used to go around and play for the Allied soldiers.
Right. I wanted to ask you too, looking at these violins and imagining them being played, I wonder if there's been a particular story or stories that have stuck with you over the years that you've devoted to these instruments. Is there a particular story that you could share with us?
Well, there are so many stories, and of course we don't have enough time, and I'm sure Jake wants to say something, and we're going to hear the violin, which is even more important. I don't think that it's my role to choose a story. Okay. Honestly, I think they're all important because in the end, the history is made out of so many different stories. I don't want to say that this story is more important than that, or that is more important than this. Of course, you can choose, the audience can choose if there's something.
Is there a particular camp story, though, of say, I know I'm pushing you on this.
Just pick one.
Yeah, well, so I'll tell you the story of the violin that you're about to hear. Yes. I think I'll go out from it. This is going to be the easiest way to go out of it.
I was thinking of, the Nazis coercing and encouraging the music, but the notion that you could listen to Schubert in the evening and, as I said, or Beethoven quartet or whatever it is, and then behave
but also
the way
jazz. I mean, they loved jazz music.
Yeah.
They made many Jewish prisoners and other prisoners play for them jazz music at night.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, because this was their favorite in many places in the SS. Right. The story of this violin, it belonged to Erich Wieninger. He was born and raised in Austria, in Vienna. He was a butcher and an amateur violinist, and after the Anschluss of Austria, his father was arrested, and the police officer was beating him so hard, he died.
Oh.
Now, Erich knew the police officer who killed his father. He wanted to get revenge, but unfortunately, he was himself arrested. He was sent to Buchenwald in Dachau, where he had his violin with him playing chamber music. And I think it was his sister or his brother who was married to a Quaker, and they somehow managed to get him released. The Nazis came to him, said, listen, take your things and go. Leave Europe, never come back here again. So he took his violin, started running away. He ended up in the Black Sea, found an illegal immigrant's boat going to Palestine. Now, all those boats were always in very bad shape, extremely overcrowded. And this particular boat, the journey took them about 2.5 or 3 months, instead of something like 10 days. The boat would break down all the time, and they had to stop and basically burn everything they had to keep the motor running. And of course, by the time they actually arrived to Palestine, they were immediately all arrested. They were sent to a detainee camp in Atlit. It's, if you know Israel, it's north of Tel Aviv, just outside Haifa. And afterwards, Erich and I think another 1,500 prisoners were sent to Mauritius, to a prison. He also had a small band there that they used to go out and play for the locals. And in the end of the war, basically what happened is that Truman, he forced basically the British government to bring back to Palestine, to Israel, all the people they expelled during the war, either to Cyprus, to Mauritius, and to many other places. And this is how he arrived to Israel, where he stayed, basically.
Amazing story. Jake, it's your turn. What on earth are you doing up here? How did a great musician like you get involved in this movement?
Oh, well, it's a...
Because you've written music inspired by the Holocaust before this, way back. So what draws you to these stories?
Well, the reason I'm up here, first of all, is that woman's fault, Patricia Christoph Moy, who had the idea over 3 years ago to bring the collection to the West Coast for the first time. The violins tour as a collection all over the world. They've been, and in the United States, to many different cities all over Europe, right? but they'd never been to the West Coast. And so Patricia told me about the collection and said she wanted a new composition to be central to the residency, certainly starting at Kohl Mansion. And I thought about it for a split second and said yes, because I have to. It's part of my responsibility to tell stories, especially meaningful, important stories that otherwise might be lost, because music brings us together in a different way so that we can absorb a story in an emotional context rather than just sort of a didactic context. And I was very inspired by the different stories. She gave me James Grimes' wonderful book about Violins of Hope, and I read that.
I have the book,
and I was incredibly moved by the fact that one of the early violins, I don't know how early it was, that your father opened to restore was filled with human ashes.
It's 1980s, yeah.
And that story alone told me these instruments have great stories to tell that we must learn about. And of course they're filled with mystery. We don't know the whole journey of these instruments because they were played before the Holocaust. Some of them had a great life before the Holocaust, and that Holocaust was just a very dark chapter in their history. And so we started thinking about how we could tell stories, and Gene Scheer, my librettist and the lyricist for this cycle, who I'd done Moby Dick and It's a Wonderful Life and many other pieces with, it was up to him to actually choose several stories to tell that seemed to work. And we decided we would have a quartet of the instruments, a solo violinist, and a singer to be the voice of the violin, so that the singer could actually talk about it from the perspective of being that instrument, in whose hands. And so the first song is really about that moment when the case is opened and who's I'm in the light again, someone's touching me, I'm filled with ashes, how did this happen? And that's the beginning of the journey. And we told 6 stories, and then there's a solo quartet movement. So it evolved over time. It was, and the Hewlett Foundation made it possible, as well as a lot of extraordinary donors throughout the Bay Area.
It'll be performed this week?
It's going to be performed Friday night, February 21st, with Mezzo Nicola Prince, a quartet of instrumentalists from the San Francisco Opera Orchestra, Kay Stern, Dawn Harms, Patricia Heller, and Emile Milland. Rebecca Jackson is going to be the solo violinist, and we have a young violinist for the passing forward of the tradition in the last song about the liberation, and that's a young man named Sean Morey.
Great.
But the premiere happened about a little over a month ago at Kohl Mansion and was tremendous experience. And to have Avshi and Amnon there was just beyond belief. Yeah.
Well, maybe it's time to introduce Rebecca.
Sure.
And get her to play for us, but just tell us a bit about Rebecca.
Right, and so before you say anything, Rebecca, I met actually through this project, again, thanks to Patricia Christoph Moy. And about a year and 4 months ago, Avshi came to Grace Cathedral and brought 4 violins, was it 4?
Yep.
And Patricia, this was the first time any of us had seen the violins or heard them. Until then, it had been in our imaginations. And I was wondering how I was going to write it. And Patricia took one, put it under her chin, and played Ravel Cottage.
Rebecca.
And which one?
Rebecca took.
Oh, Rebecca, sorry. It's early, people. I'm still drinking the elixir. Sorry. She picked one up and put it under her chin and played Ravel Cottage, and suddenly everything, that intonation, that resonance suddenly came to life again. That timeless sound that we always go back to, that to me is always going on somewhere, and every now and then we tune into the frequency, which is why then the piece became, we decided to call it Intonations. Thank you. Rebecca.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say, just like Jake gave credit to Patricia, who's the executive director of music at Kohl Mansion, that's the reason I'm up here with these incredible people, is because of Patricia. And when she invited me to come and play on the Violins of Hope, I immediately called my dear friend, a survivor, Dr. Jack Terry in New York City, because I said, what should I play on these instruments? And so he was the one who first introduced me to this incredible piece by Ravel, which I'll play for you.
So this is the Kaddish as set by Maurice Ravel.
What strikes me and why music is so important is that it's particular, Ravel, and yet at the same time universal. And how you as a musician do that very well. I mean, I think seeing your operas as well as listening to you, Rebecca, is that kind of, I feel very kind of torn by being strangely included in something that is different and alien to me. And that is a very healing thing, I think. Have you any thoughts about that?
It can take us outside of ourselves and surprise us. My good friend, Sister Helen Prejean, who wrote the book Dead Man Walking, always says music can take you to parts of your heart that you didn't even know you had.
Right.
And that's, I think, what we go and listen to it for, to awaken us. Right. And that's part of our job, is to wake people up as musicians and artists. That's one of my callings, is to try to find stories that will surprise people and give them fresh perspective on a human experience that they might not have considered.
I think there's another piece that Rebecca's going to play.
Yes. Right after Rebecca, played this violin in a year and 4 months ago or so, Gene started to write, and one of the first things he wrote was the first song called Ashes, which is about that opening of the case and finding ashes in it. And he wrote what became a theme for the whole piece, and the words are, when they told him not to pray, told him to forget, when they told him not to hope, he played the violin. And that became the theme for the whole piece. And this excerpt that you're going to hear, this solo violin excerpt, is from the third song, which is about the story of Henry Meyer, who survived and went on to found the La Salle Quartet in New York. But while he was in the camp where his family had been killed, he was ordered by the Nazis to play a concert in the gas chamber because the acoustics were so much better. In the same room where his family had been killed. And so he's ordered, Gene wrote a text, I'll read a little bit of it, and at the very end, the singer recites the Kaddish, and then there's a slow soliloquy. But the first part of it is, play something romantic, the commandant orders, something from before all this. The officers are all seated, they tap their feet as they wait for the concert to begin. And the violin is speaking. Henry looks up at the shower heads that have never shed a drop of water. We know why. Here in the gas chamber, everything but murder is a lie. Forgive me, he whispers, but if I play, I will not die today. And so I think it goes to the core of what these instruments represent. They represent hope, survival, possibility, connection, something beautiful in the midst of something so terrible. Very, like you said, very conflicting and very difficult. And so after the violin, the singer recites the interior voice of Henry saying the Kaddish, and that concert is over, this moment happens.
I know this is an impossible question for you, Rebecca, but what's it like to play one of these instruments?
That's a question I've been asked before and something I've continued to think about. I think there's two main things for me. Is one, it gives me perspective, like a lot of other moments and situations in our lives, not only as a musician, but also as a human being. And I think it also teaches me history in a brand new way. I think there are defining moments in our lives that are etched in our memories. And for me, some of them, as a young girl, reading The Diary of Anne Frank, really, that was kind of the beginning of my exploration of this impossible to understand dark period in our history. Then another moment was walking the grounds at Auschwitz. And then my violin teacher, who was a survivor, when he started opening up to me about his tragic past and the violence saving him.
This was David Arbon?
Yes,
Yeah.
saving him in the camps. And now having this opportunity that Patricia has given me and the Weinsteins and getting to play Jake's incredible music, it's just a defining moment in my life.
Mm. Yes, the fact that your mentor was a Holocaust survivor must have been an amazing kind of gift to you in a dark way, yeah. Mm.
I should say, do you mind, Patricia, if I tell your story? Patricia's father was liberated from Auschwitz. So this project has special resonance for her as well. Yeah.
So, all of you, what should we listen for on Friday, for those who can come? What, in that sacred space upstairs?
Well, these were actually very challenging. This was a very challenging piece to write on many levels, but part of it was that these songs, you think about getting into one sort of emotional state and then you meditate on that and get through it. This is storytelling in addition to, so they're almost like ballads in a way, except not. Mm-hmm. So I think they'll have the words, yes, in the program. You'll hear extraordinary violin playing, and also the full quartet. They're all instruments of hope. One of the songs is about the violin that Rebecca is playing right now, Eric. There is a viola and a cello. There's one in the collection of each, and those will be performed as well.
So there are mainly violins in the collection?
Yeah, running around with the cello in those times.
Yeah. Difficult.
Yeah, difficult. But you'll also hear things that sound familiar. In one of the songs, the story of Mottola, I quote the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto quite a bit, because Mottola was developing a career as a child prodigy when he and his family were taken prisoner, and his entire family he was 9 years old. And by the time he was 12, all his family was gone. He was alone, but a German officer had recognized that he could play and entertain them, so he was forced to play at the German Officers Club. And the violin keeps telling him, "You're not alone." And that's one of the big things in music, that life can be very lonely, but with music and with an instrument, you're never alone. And so Mottola develops this secret where he leaves his violin in the basement of the Officers Club, and with the violin case, week by week by week, he brings gunpowder that he sneaks into there, and eventually has enough to build a bomb and lights it and explodes the entire Officers Club and watches from the distance. So you'll hear the explosion, you'll hear the Mendelssohn Concerto keeping him company, you'll hear the voices of his parents, and in this song that we just had the excerpt from, suddenly there's this boisterous waltz, because that's what Henry had to play to save his life in the gas chamber. So you'll hear references to music that sounds very familiar, as well as emotional conflicts and the difficulties of that. You'll hear the quartet by itself with a lament.
One of the most beautiful moments in the whole piece.
And then the liberation, which emerges out of the lament with the solo violin and then the young violinist joining, which is, initially we really wanted it to be that the young violinist walked in and took a violin from Avshi or Amnon, his father, and then played.
Play it.
But practically speaking, that doesn't work, because you still have to tune the violin. So he walks in and joins for the last song. It's a very moving moment. So it's about a 40-minute piece from beginning to end, and the quartet will play Schubert and Mendelssohn in the first part to show you what these instruments were designed to play initially before the war, and probably many of them did, and were forced to play during the war too. Not the Mendelssohn, but the Schubert. And so it's a real journey that the entire group goes on, listening to the violins tell their story through music and words.
You remind me, Andrew Solomon writing about his depression, saying that the journey doesn't take the pain away, but enables you to have your pain in a deeper place. It's not very encouraging, but it's a bit encouraging. But it's a great statement of actually, it's not a kind of soporific kind of drug, but it deepens the pain, but also deepens the ability to bear it and to go to a deeper place.
I think it also deepens our connection between each other.
Yeah,
That's
right.
what changes when we go to a sacred space, whether that be Grace Cathedral, the Opera House, a concert hall, a community center, and we experience something together as a community. You forget about like the fact that you don't know the people around you necessarily. You don't know how they voted. You don't know what they support or believe in. You don't know who they're going to vote for. And none of that really matters in the moment, because it's about being a human being and learning something and having that sense of community. And that's what music does for us. It's transformative.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. I wanted to remind the audience that we will take questions for our guests on the cards in front of you, so to give you some heads up to write the questions down, so that if you need a card or a pen, just wave. And our Rebecca, we have two Rebeccas here today, will bring something to you. She'll be circulating from the room. And also, this book, Violins of Hope, is available also to you if you'd like to read further about the program and about the events that we're talking about. So, what haven't we talked about that you'd like people to take? I mean, this is one of the frustrating things. Because you've just come in from Israel, you haven't been, in the country, but you came on Friday, I think.
Yeah, I came Friday afternoon, yeah.
Friday afternoon. What, is there anything particular that you'd like the audience to take away with them?
Well, like you mentioned before, I mean, we are talking about history. For some of us, it sounds like ancient history, 75 years ago, but if we actually look around, we might not have learned enough. And things are changing, and there is always a chance that things will change to bad and from bad to worse. I mean, we see what's going on now also in Germany as well. In one of the local governments in Germany, they had to basically share a part with one of the national socialists to form a government. And as much as we think that we are smarter and we learn from history, maybe we didn't really learn enough, or we didn't take it deep enough.
Yeah, historians will never be out of a job.
Probably not.
Because they'll keep rewriting it. And we in the United States haven't come to terms with our history totally at all, really. There's a comment from one of you here, and it's not a question, but a comment. After the war, some Nazi doctors immigrated to America, where they got jobs in state hospitals, even on children's wards. Brandenburg déjà vu. History doesn't really have endings, does it? Same point that...
Well, it's not only doctors, it's scientists basically all over the world, also here in the United States. Many of them ran to South America because this was kind of far away from everybody, and formed their own things there. And some of them were caught, some of them were sentenced. Unfortunately, the vast majority wasn't.
Yeah. And when you think of Protestants and Catholics, both sides believe that Hitler came from God or was supported by God.
It's amazing.
Well, they thought about it about many other people, and they still think about it on other people as well. But I mean,
in the last song, Gene Scheer's text is very much about this. I would love to read it. This is the violin. Of course, the voice of the violin singing, "Is it over, finally over? Did we survive again?" A tired soldier gives him a piece of bread and says, "Open your eyes, arise, my friend, the liberation has begun." Is it over? Can it really be over for a moment? Yes, but a moment only.
Yeah.
The past is a clock without any hands. When the wheel of history comes round, when hatred is chanted and screamed again, when innocents are blamed again, when the gun is loaded, when the match is lit, let someone pick me up And let me sing again to remember. Remember this. When they tell us not to pray, tell us to forget. When they tell us not to hope, we will play these violins.
Oh, wow.
Gene is an amazing writer.
It is. It really does speak powerfully to the tension between that phrase, when people say, well, why do you bother? Better to light a candle than curse the darkness. Yeah. But at the same time, the opposite is true, is to light a candle is to cast a shadow, or to produce a shadow. That to be aware of our shadow sides of things and our own need for healing and forgiveness as well. And then really music be drawing us into that tremendous solidarity. What struck me, for example, I mean, it's a very corny example about the opera, of having, I must have seen The Marriage of Figaro, I don't know how many times over the past 50 years, really, and or more, and seeing the recent production of at the San Francisco Opera, it was like seeing it anew, seeing it afresh, and actually being open to that new experience of your life rather than a kind of depressing repetition, that endless repetition, which really pulls one down into a depressive place. It's not that the pain is taken away, but you're given a kind of a newness, and a new lease on life, if you like.
I think every time the violins are played, every time you play, Rebecca, on these instruments, every time you restore a new one, it's an act of defiance.
Yeah.
It really is an act of rebellion and an act of hope. Like you were saying, music gives us hope. And it's so interesting that they're called violins of hope, not violins of despair or darkness. They really are violins of hope, because as long as they're played, as long as the stories are told, then there's hope.
Are they owned by a trust or by individual? They're owned by you?
Right now by our band, because he owns us, but yeah, they belongs to us.
But you're the guardians of that, yeah. Yeah, let's see what we have here. This is a big question, and you could choose a little bit of it. Could you tell the stories of the other violins you brought today? Can you tell a story about any of those four?
Yes. So the violin, which is here, not this one, not the first one, the second one, it belonged to a Polish Jewish person, Schatzberg, and he managed to get fake papers that showed him as a Catholic, named Sawicki. And this is how he stayed outside of the ghetto during the war in Poland. He played in street corners and small coffee shops, and this is basically how he survived.
Wow.
And some years after the war, he was invited here to the United States by the personal invitation of Dr. Jonas Salk, the guy who made the polio vaccination, and he moved here, established a family here, and stayed here for the rest of his life.
Right. That's a great story. Any more?
The violin next to it, which was played by Rebecca until quite recently, belonged to Henry Brender. And Henry was born and raised in Budapest. And he was a child prodigy, going around playing concerts. And during the war, he was in a forced labor camp with his violin. Later on, he ran and joined the partisans. And he survived the war in Hungary. And later on, he became part of the orchestra. But once they heard that he wants to immigrate to Israel, and you're talking about the 50s, it's already the Iron Curtain in full power, basically. He was thrown out of the orchestra, and a few years later, he actually managed to immigrate to Israel. And
is it great?
And he stayed. He joined the Israeli Philharmonic until he basically retired.
Jake, you said before we came up here, and not to put you on the spot, because it wasn't a statement of cultural appropriation, but you said that having worked on this and done a lot of operas, that somewhere along the line you must be Jewish.
I think I have a Jewish soul, I've been told. But and Gene Scheer even said to me, like in one of the songs there's a wedding dance that starts off slow and gets faster and faster and faster. And Gene said to me after he heard it the first time, he goes, "You're sure you're not a little Jewish?" And I don't know. I feel like I probably am. My family, I'm half Hungarian, and they left Hungary in around 1900, 1901, and went to Brazil for like a year, and then moved to the United States through Ellis Island. But I don't know much about my family history before that, so it's entirely possible. But I'm drawn to stories of social justice and
God is a storyteller.
Yep.
God is a storyteller.
Yeah.
In Judaism.
Yeah.
Very strong. For me, that background as really leaving the questions open all the time.
Yeah.
That story about the rabbi in Alexandria talking about the Torah was like an enormous castle with thousands of rooms, and all the doors are locked, and outside each room is a golden key, and it's the wrong key. I love that. There's a kind of sense, your point about our common humanity, that in order to unlock one of those doors, we've got to have a tremendous group activity, all trying them together, and maybe between us, we can unlock one of those doors. And it's that openness in Jewish spirituality that touches me always deeply.
I think we also all wonder about where we came from, what those people were like, what motivated them, how they found each other, how they moved, why they moved, how we wound up in this place today. And I think it's the same with these violins. They feel very much alive and full of personality. And so to explore their stories and who's held them and how they made this unbelievable journey to be with us today is fascinating. All of us have a story, and all of us wonder about the people that came before that led us here. So I think those stories are really amazing, interesting.
Are many of the violins very old? I mean, what?
Depends what you consider as very old.
Well,
the oldest one,
18th century.
The oldest one that we have in the collection is from 1771.
That's old.
Yeah, so 250 years old. The vast majority would be give or take between around 100 to 120 years, maybe a bit more. The violin of Henry Brender is about 150, 160 years, maybe a bit more.
So the next question, what's the next for each of you? And where do the violins travel next? Or perhaps there's a next musical project, but what's next for each of you? Where do the violins travel next? Is there another project in the making?
Yes, so the day we are done here, I think 15th of March, I'm going to Los Angeles. After Los Angeles, the instruments are going to go to Richmond, Virginia. And then when Virginia is finished, we are going to meet in Santa Cruz here. Santa Cruz, right? I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, for the Cabrillo Music
Festival.
For
the Cabrillo Music Festival. Then the instruments will finally go to Israel for a week. And because when we bring them to United States, they come with a special import-export paper, which is good for 1 year. So I have to bring them back to Israel. And after a week, we are going to Guadeloupe for a project. And then in end of September, beginning of October, we start again in Princeton, New Jersey, West Virginia, Canada, Canada, New Hampshire probably, and then Sioux City. And
do you keep a journal?
I keep a phone. My phone tells me where I need to go and when. Yeah. Okay. I don't. My journal is right now ends around February 2025.
Wow. It's an incredible story. Yes, please.
How are they packed? You don't buy them, you just see.
How are they packed? I'm just repeating it.
Well, they have cases. I mean, I have many cases for 4 violins. And when we ship them in a special environment-controlled container, which they use for medicines. So it has its own battery and all cooling system that makes sure that through the whole journey it's the same temperature and humidity.
So they're not on the same plane with you?
No, I was offered, but these are rather cargo planes that are not that comfortable.
And this we'll have to draw to an end, but it says, the question is this, many of the musicians who have played these violins said that they feel the souls of all those who played them. Can any of you speak to that, particularly Rebecca? you're feeling part of a continuity of many people who played that violin before you.
Yeah, definitely. I think as I've been one of the musicians also going into the schools with the Violins of Hope, and that's something I've been sharing is kind of now when you look at anything, whether it's a musical instrument, you can wonder what the unique story and history of it is, and like each of us has our own unique story, but definitely I feel that.
Definitely, that sense of continuity. I want to thank you all for coming today, giving us this inspiring and stimulating, and for me, disturbing testimony. I think when people say to me, things are terrible, we're going down the tubes, and I basically try and say in a pastoral way, you don't have to make things worse. And as I said, better to light a candle than curse the darkness. And thank you so much for what you do. Look forward to Friday in the cathedral, and the program that this Violins of Hope program has inspired is amazing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next week's forum, the Dean, Malcolm Young, will be here to interview the highly acclaimed sociologist Christine Carter on her book, The New Adolescence, and we hope to see you at the Violins of Hope on Friday. You're always, of course, welcome to attend the choral Eucharist service upstairs at 11 o'clock. I want to remind you that we rely on your support for the forum, so please make a gift of whatever you can afford before leaving. And thank you again to Avshi, Jake, and Rebecca for joining us this morning and giving us hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you.